I'll never forget that cold night in Boston, Massachusetts, the kind of night when the city feels as if it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The rain was relentless, drumming a nervous rhythm against the windows of my tiny third-floor apartment. I was exhausted from another long shift at the bookstore on Boylston Street, my feet aching. My mind numb from hours spent shelving new releases and ringing up customers who barely made eye contact. I was 24, living paycheck to paycheck, still clinging to the hope that life would eventually give me a break. I had no idea how quickly everything could change. As I left the bookstore, the city was washed in a pale orange glow from the streetlights reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement. I remember tightening the hood of my old green raincoat and running the short distance to the parking lot, my breath coming out in frosty puffs. My car, a blue 2006 Honda Civic. I'd bought used for $1,500 after months of saving tips from the cafe I used to work at, sat alone in the corner, its windows fogged up from the damp. I fumbled with the keys, shivering, wishing I could afford something better but grateful at least to have wheels in a city like Boston. Driving home that night, the city felt like a ghost town. Hardly anyone was out, except the occasional figure hunched under an umbrella or the blurry shapes of taxis splashing through puddles. I turned up the radio to keep myself awake, humming along to an old song I barely knew. My mind wandered, thinking about the bills waiting on my kitchen table, the almost empty fridge, and the friend I hadn't seen in months. I didn't notice, at first, how slick the road had become. It happened in an instant. As I rounded the sharp bend near the Charles River, the car in front of me braked suddenly. I pressed my brakes, but the tires lost grip. For a split second, I saw the world in slow motion, the headlights bouncing off the guardrail, the sudden jolt as the steering wheel pulled from my hands, the violent spin as the car skidded sideways. Then everything sped up, metal shrieking, glass shattering, my head slamming hard against the window. The last thing I remember was the taste of blood and the cold rain pouring in as the door buckled. I woke up to bright lights and the sharp smell of antiseptic. The beeping of machines, voices I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was a dream. But when I tried to move, pain shot through my left leg, and I realized I was in a hospital bed, and force snaking out of my arm, my forehead bandaged. My whole body ached, and every breath felt like a struggle. It was the kind of pain that doesn't just hurt, it scares you. Because it's so deep, so consuming, you wonder if you'll ever feel normal again. A nurse with kind eyes and a patient voice explained what had happened. I'd been unconscious for several hours, they said. The police had found my phone in the wreckage and called my parents in Ohio. At first, I was surprised they actually reached out to them. I thought maybe this was the moment my parents would finally care, would show up for me, would realize I mattered. Even as I lay there hurting, that small hope lit up inside me, fragile but real. But the officer came to see me later that day, a grim look on his face. He told me what my parents, David and Linda Miller, had said on the phone. The words have echoed in my mind ever since, sharp and cold as broken glass. We're on a trip to Europe. If that worthless kid's gone, that's fine. And then they hung up. No questions about my injuries, no promise to come back, no hint of worry or concern, just a blunt, cruel sentence and then silence. I tried to laugh it off at first, telling the nurse I was used to it, but the truth was it felt like being hit by another car. Only this time there was no hospital, no doctor, no medicine to help. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, I realized how alone I really was. My parents hadn't been great when I was growing up, but I'd always told myself they were just busy, just tired, just overwhelmed by life. I thought maybe deep down they loved me or at least cared a little. But now I knew the truth. I could have died, and it wouldn't have made any difference to them. In that moment, as I listened to the rain against the hospital window, I felt something inside me break, but strangely, I also felt free. The hospital was a lonely place, especially late at night. My roommate was an elderly woman named Margaret, who snored softly and sometimes called out for her late husband in her sleep. I watched the shadows on the ceiling, counting the minutes until dawn, wondering how I would pay the hospital bills, what I would do about work, how I would walk again without pain. But most of all, I wondered who I was if I didn't have a family to fall back on anymore. I felt like a ghost drifting through my own life, invisible and untethered. But I also felt something else, something like courage, or maybe just a stubborn will to survive. That first night, I made a promise to myself. If I made it out of that hospital, I would never go back. Not just to my parents, but to the old life I had accepted for so long. I would find a way to build something new, something better, even if it meant starting from nothing. I would learn to stand on my own 2 feet, no matter how hard or lonely it might be. Now, looking back, I see that night as the end of one story and the beginning of another. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done waiting for someone else to rescue me. The night everything changed. I decided to save myself. Leaving the hospital wasn't a moment of freedom the way I'd hoped. It felt more like stepping into a thunderstorm without an umbrella. The doctors were kind enough, but the bills started arriving before I'd even left the parking lot in the wheelchair they insisted I use. It was staggering. The insurance covered the bare minimum just enough to keep me alive, not enough to keep me afloat. I stared at the numbers on the invoices and realized that for the first time in my life, I couldn't even call my parents for help. I didn't want to, even if I could. The memory of their words, so cold, so final, made me shiver even when the sun was out. What little strength I had was matched by the stubbornness I'd always relied on. And the one lifeline I still had left was my friend Sarah. I'd known her since my college days at Northeastern. And she was the kind of friend who always knew when to text, even if we hadn't spoken in months. After my accident, she'd messaged me nearly every day, checking on me, offering encouragement, asking if I needed anything. When I finally admitted how bad things were, she didn't hesitate. "Come to Chicago. I've got a couch with your name on it. We'll figure the rest out." It was hard to say goodbye to Boston. That city had been my home for 6 years, the backdrop to my college life, my first job, my first taste of independence. But all I had left there was a stack of bills, a car that no longer ran, and a silence so heavy it made my chest ache. I limped through my apartment, packing the few things I could carry: some clothes, a battered copy of Jane Eyre, a cheap laptop, a few photos of better days, and shoved everything into an old duffel bag. My bank account held less than $200, barely enough for the train ticket to Chicago. But Sarah wired me the last $50 I needed without a second thought. The ride from Boston to Chicago took over 20 hours and felt even longer. I watched the landscape roll by through smudged glass, every mile pulling me further from the life I'd known. Sometimes I caught glimpses of myself in the window pale, tired, but still there. I wondered if this was what starting over looked like. Not dramatic, not like in the movies, but slow, lonely, a little bit desperate. Sarah's apartment was a tiny 2-bedroom on the edge of Logan Square. It smelled like cinnamon and coffee, and she'd left a pile of clean towels and a handwritten note on the couch. "You're safe here," she'd written. I believed her. For a few weeks, I slept under her grandmother's old quilt and tried to ignore the guilt that crept up when I heard her making coffee before dawn, heading out to work a double shift so I wouldn't feel like a burden. We spent our evenings sitting on the fire escape, talking about everything and nothing. She told me about her job at the bakery, her dreams of traveling to Europe, and the landlord who collected old coins. I told her about my plans, though I wasn't sure what they were, just that I knew I couldn't stay still, couldn't let this become the end of my story. But Chicago was expensive, and I could see the worry in Sarah's eyes every time she looked at her bank statements. I scrolled through job postings every day, sent out resumes, but my legs still hurt. And most places weren't willing to take a chance on someone who couldn't stand for long shifts. One evening, as we sat on the couch sharing instant noodles and a bottle of cheap wine, Sarah squeezed my hand. "You've got to go somewhere you can start fresh," she said softly. "Somewhere you can disappear and become whoever you want." That night, I started looking at train tickets to New York City. If I were going to start over, I wanted to do it in a place big enough that nobody would notice me. Or, better yet, where I could finally stand out for all the right reasons. The ticket was almost all the money I had left, but I bought it anyway. The next morning, Sarah hugged me tightly and slipped another $20 into my pocket. "Text me when you get there. And remember, you're braver than you think." New York was everything I hoped and feared. Vast, noisy, teeming with life at every hour. The city buzzed in a way Boston never had. The air was heavy with ambition, hope, and sometimes the scent of trash and hot pretzels. The first thing I noticed was how easy it was to disappear here. Everyone was running from something, or chasing something else. It didn't matter who you were, only that you kept moving. I found a cheap room in a brownstone in Brooklyn, listed on a flyer taped to a lamppost outside the train station. It wasn't much, just a cramped space at the top of a narrow staircase, with a window overlooking a rusted fire escape, but it was mine, at least for a little while. I shared the place with two strangers, Jessica, a grad student who spent most nights at the library, and Mark, a musician who paid his share of the rent by playing bass at jazz bars downtown. They didn't ask questions about why I was there or where I'd come from. Maybe they recognized something in me, or maybe they just didn't care. Either way, it was a relief. We bonded over ramen noodles cooked on the hot plate in the kitchen, cheap red wine bought from the corner store, and the unspoken understanding that sometimes starting over meant accepting help from whoever offered it. Jessica taught me how to make coffee with a French press. Mark played his music late into the night, filling the house with soft, soulful melodies. In their company, I began to believe, for the first time, that I could belong somewhere. Money was tight, but I managed to land a job at a small coffee shop near Prospect Park. The pay was low $8 an hour plus tips, but the owner, Mrs. Hawkins, reminded me of my favorite teacher in high school, stern but kind and always honest. She didn't care about my limp or my past. She cared that I showed up on time and treated customers with respect. I worked hard, saving every dollar I could, learning how to stretch a paycheck further than I ever thought possible. Sometimes, after a long shift, I'd sit outside the shop with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set over the park, and feel a flicker of hope in my chest. For the first time in my life, I was doing it on my own. No help from parents, no safety net, no one to let me down but myself. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. Every morning, I woke up knowing that whatever happened, good or bad, was because of my choices. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew this much. I was moving forward, one step at a time, and that was enough. The days in Brooklyn had settled into a kind of rhythm, a pattern of early mornings, coffee shop shifts, and quiet evenings shared with Jessica and Mark in our creaky old brownstone. I was starting to feel almost normal again. Some nights, when the city was still and all you could hear were distant sirens and the hum of traffic, I'd lie awake and think about how close I'd come to losing everything. Sometimes I wondered what my parents were doing, if they ever thought about me at all, or if their trip through Europe had erased me from their minds for good. I hadn't spoken to them since that day in the hospital, and for weeks my phone was silent except for texts from Sarah and the occasional group message from my roommates. I told myself I was better off without my parents' voices in my life, and for a while I believed it. But underneath that belief was a restless anxiety, like waiting for a thunderstorm that might never come. The call, when it came, arrived late on a Sunday morning. The coffee shop had been slow, the weather gloomy and gray. I was in the middle of folding laundry in my tiny room, still wearing my apron, when the phone buzzed loudly against the table. The screen lit up with a familiar number from my childhood, my mother's number. The sight of it made my heart thud against my ribs. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me, some old habit of obedience, made me answer. Hello? My voice sounded steadier than I felt. There was a pause, then my mother's voice, sharper than I remembered. Where have you been? She demanded, not bothering with hello or any kind of greeting. The bank keeps calling us. Why haven't you paid the loan yet? It was so abrupt, so businesslike, that for a moment I just stood there, clutching the phone in disbelief. After everything that had happened, after the accident, the hospital, the silence, this was the first thing she had to say to me. I felt an absurd urge to laugh, a brittle, wild laughter that threatened to spill out. I took a slow breath, grounding myself. Are you serious, Mom? I was in a car accident. I almost died. Nobody called. Nobody cared. And now weeks later, you call me about a loan? She huffed, as if my survival was a minor inconvenience, and plowed on. Your name is on that paperwork. The bank won't stop calling us. You need to deal with this. It's your responsibility. It was as if my pain, my recovery, my new life, all of it was invisible to her. All that mattered was the money. I could feel the old anger rising inside me, but instead of swallowing it, I let it fill me. For the first time in my life, I didn't try to make excuses or apologize for things that weren't my fault. "I don't know, Mom," I said, my voice low and calm. "Maybe you should ask your worthless kid. That's what you told the police, right?" When I was lying in a hospital bed, barely conscious, there was a long, heavy silence on the line. I pictured her face, the cold set of her mouth, the way she used to look right through me when I was a child. Maybe she thought I'd always come back, always be the good daughter, no matter how badly she treated me. But I was done being that girl. Then her voice snapped back, louder now, tinged with panic and anger. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. We did everything we could for you, and you're just throwing it all away. The least you could do is pay your debts and stop making problems for us." Something inside me broke then, but it wasn't pain, it was relief. I realized that the person on the other end of the phone wasn't my mother, not in the way I needed. She was just a woman who happened to give birth to me, who cared more about bank calls and social appearances than the life of her only child. My hands trembled, but my voice didn't shake. "You know what, Mom? I'm not your problem anymore. If the bank calls, you can tell them the truth. I'm starting my own life now. Whatever you and Dad want from me, you're not going to get it. Not money, not forgiveness, not anything." She shouted something else, her voice shrill and desperate, but I couldn't listen anymore. I hung up, letting the phone drop onto the pile of unfolded laundry. My whole body was buzzing, a mix of adrenaline and sadness and something dangerously close to pride. I'd never hung up on my mother before. I'd always tried to keep the peace, to make myself small and quiet, to fit whatever shape she needed me to be. "Not anymore." His silence after that call was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I sat on my bed and let it wash over me, feeling grief and freedom all tangled together. Tears pricked my eyes, but I didn't cry. Instead, I found myself breathing more deeply, more easily, as if a weight I'd carried for years had finally slipped away. That day, I took a long walk through Prospect Park, the chill in the air biting at my cheeks. The trees were bare, the grass a patchwork of old leaves and stubborn green. I watched kids playing near the pond, couples holding hands, people living their lives without fear. I wondered if they knew how lucky they were, or if they too were carrying burdens nobody else could see. As I walked, I kept replaying the call in my head, each time feeling less afraid, less ashamed. My parents' voices didn't have power over me anymore. Their approval, their anger, their demands, they were just echoes now, fading into the background. For the first time, I understood what it meant to let go. When I got home, Jessica was in the kitchen making tea. She took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. She just poured me a mug and sat with me in comfortable silence, the steam rising between us. I realized that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who sit with you quietly when you need it most, who believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself. That call wasn't the end of anything, it was the beginning. I was free now, truly free, to decide what I wanted, to build a life on my terms. If my parents wanted to chase money and appearances, let them. I was finished sacrificing my happiness for theirs. I would take my scars, my pain, and my stubborn hope, and I would use them to carve out a future worth living. Looking back, I know that standing up for myself that day was the hardest and bravest thing I've ever done. And I know I'll never regret it, not for a single moment. With my past finally behind me, I decided to stop waiting for happiness to find me, and instead started building something for myself slowly, carefully, but with a stubborn kind of hope that I'd never had before. Every day in Brooklyn felt a little less heavy, a little less shadowed by old pain. I focused on the present, on the tiny victories that, when pieced together, made me feel like I was finally moving forward. I started by saving every single dollar I could from the coffee shop. I picked up extra shifts, even on weekends when I wanted nothing more than to rest. The regulars began to know my name and recognize me for my smile, not the faint scar near my hairline or the way I sometimes limped when my leg was tired. People who once just mumbled their orders started to linger at the counter, sharing stories or jokes or the kind of ordinary conversation I'd always missed growing up. There was Mrs. Russo, who tipped $1 every morning and always asked about my writing, and Jamal, who came in for black coffee and a blueberry muffin before heading off to teach at the local school. Each of them, in some small way, helped me believe that I wasn't invisible anymore, Outside of work, my world kept growing. My roommates, Jessica and Mark, had slowly become something like family. Jessica was always there with quiet advice and a steadying presence, the kind that made the worst days a little less hard. Mark would cook dinner when he was home, filling the house with the sound of laughter and music, playing old jazz records on his ancient turntable. We'd sit at the chipped kitchen table late into the night, talking about everything from art to the weirdness of city life to what we wanted for our futures. Sometimes, when the world felt too big, their simple kindness anchored me. It was Jessica who encouraged me to enroll in night classes at the community college. She found the brochure in a stack of mail, handed it to me with a soft nudge, and said, "You should write." It took weeks for me to work up the courage, but eventually I walked into the admissions office and signed up for creative writing. The first night I sat in that classroom, surrounded by strangers scribbling in notebooks, I was terrified. My hands shook as I wrote, afraid my story wasn't worth telling. But as the weeks passed, something inside me loosened. I wrote about pain, about hope, about new beginnings and old wounds. My instructor, Miss Alvarez, was tough but fair. When she handed back my first assignment with a scribbled note that said, "You have a voice. Use it," I felt a spark of pride I hadn't felt in years. Little by little, my confidence grew. I started keeping a journal again, filling pages with memories and observations, some dark, some hopeful, all honest. Sometimes I wrote late at night in the soft yellow glow of the kitchen, with Mark humming in the background and Jessica working quietly at her laptop. I even started to dream about writing a book someday, maybe a memoir, maybe fiction, but always something true. There was a strange comfort in knowing that the worst parts of my life could become stories, and maybe one day help someone else feel less alone. The seasons shifted in New York, from the biting chill of winter to the shy, hopeful sunlight of spring. It was Sarah, as always, who reminded me to celebrate how far I'd come. She called one evening with wild excitement in her voice. "You need a break," she insisted. "Let's go to Europe just for a week. I'll cover the plane tickets if you can scrape together some spending money." I laughed, almost said no, then surprised us both by saying yes. We flew to Ireland that May, our first time in Europe. It felt surreal to stand on those green cliffs with Sarah, the Atlantic wind whipping our hair as we stared out over the endless, churning sea. There was a stillness there, a peace that I hadn't known in years. Sarah and I wandered through little towns, ate pastries in tiny cafes, and talked for hours about the lives we wanted to live. On our last day, we climbed a hill overlooking the ocean and watched the clouds roll past. I felt, for the first time, truly free from my parents' voices, from old debts, from the ache of disappointment that had followed me for so long. My life wasn't easy, but it was mine. And for the first time, that was enough. When we returned to New York, everything felt brighter. Even the loudness of the city was welcome, almost comforting. I walked different streets, noticed new things. I was lighter. I started volunteering at a local shelter on Saturdays, helping serve food and listening to the stories of people who'd been through their storms. Their resilience inspired me. I realized that, for the first time, I was building a life that felt real, a life full of purpose, connection, and moments of joy. There were still hard days. Sometimes, in the quiet of the early morning, memories would surface: my mother's voice on the phone, my father's silence, the hospital room with its humming machines. But the hurt didn't cut as deep as before. Now, those memories were part of my story, but they didn't define it. I learned to forgive, not for their sake, but for my own. Letting go of that anger gave me space for new things, for laughter, for love, for hope. Jessica finished her graduate degree and found a job in publishing, while Mark's band started booking bigger gigs in Manhattan. We threw ourselves a little party in the apartment, bought a cheap cake and a bottle of champagne, and toasted to new beginnings. I looked around at my friends, my chosen family, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: contentment. One afternoon, after work, Mrs. Hawkins, the coffee shop owner, called me into her office. She handed me a small envelope with a handwritten note. Inside was a modest bonus and a card that said, "Thank you for your hard work and kindness. You make this place better." I cried in the storeroom, happy tears this time. For so long, I had believed I was only ever a burden, never an asset. It was a small thing, but to me it meant everything. The future was still uncertain. Rent was still due, the city was still noisy, and some nights the loneliness would sneak up on me. But I knew, deep down, that I could handle whatever came next. I had survived loss, disappointment, and heartbreak, and I had found my way through. I had friends who loved me, work that mattered, and a story to tell. If anyone ever asks me about my past, I just smile and say, that was another life. This one's my own. And finally, I believe it.